My name is Aaron Stein, president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and we're joined by Afshon Ostovar, who is an associate professor and uh, director of research of the Department of National Security Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School. He is also the author of, and I'm going to read it, Wars of Ambition, the U.S., Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. He's also a fellow with us at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And as we get going here, Afshon is a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, but all of his thoughts that he will be expressing here in this webinar are those of his alone, and certainly not those of the Department of Defense, the Naval Postgraduate School, or sort of any other affiliation of the U.S. government. Did I get that right, Afshon?
Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. My pleasure. All right. Well, if you are like me, you've been following sort of at sort of the granular level exactly what's been going on in the Middle East, obviously with the Israelis striking Iran and Iran striking Israel with ballistic missiles. And as we were talking off air here before we started, Afshan, you and I have been in many a war game where we have played through this scenario, I don't know, half a dozen times, you probably more than me. And it's certainly not going the way that we had ever sort of, let's say, scenario planned it or stress tested it in any number of war game that you and I at least have been involved with. But that is the tee up to tell us, this is maybe 48 hours to 72 hours into the conflict. I can't quite remember, maybe a little bit more. Where are we at? What's been happening?
Well, as far as we can tell, right? I mean, the main thing I would stress is we don't really know what's happening in Iran. Iran's not releasing battle damage assessments. We don't know what's happening underground. We don't know exactly the value of many of the buildings that have been hit. We may suspect the value, but we don't exactly know. So time will tell precisely what's happening. But what we can say, I think conservatively, is that Iran is getting curb stomped by Israel right now, right? And its military is being eviscerated. Its strategic capabilities are being eviscerated. Its nuclear program has been damaged. The above ground sites, at least, have suffered a lot of damage. Its missile factories, production facilities, fuel production and processing facilities have all been heavily damaged. Its command and control has been heavily hit. A lot of its top commanders have been killed. Its nuclear scientists have also been decapitated. That's to say that the leadership of its nuclear scientists has been assassinated. Tehran is being bombarded. There are buildings being hit in the urban centers of Iran that we don't exactly know what they are. They're being hit. Iran's anti-air systems have been mostly destroyed. Its missile launchers are being hit as Iran pulls them out to launch missiles. So by and large, Iran is on the losing side of a war very quickly. Iran has been able to respond less and less over time, and it's not exactly clear why, other than losing missile launchers and maybe access to missile sites. And it has done some damage to Israel. It certainly is putting a lot of stress on the Israeli population by forcing them into bunkers every few hours. But by and large, I think what we will see emerge from this, at the very least, is a very different Islamic Republic and a much weaker military of the Islamic Republic.
So let's dive into this to this as well. The stated Israeli objective of this is to roll back the nuclear program. And I want to come to the nuclear program in my follow-up question to this. Me personally, and perhaps you disagree, as soon as the strikes began, it became, at least what I think, an operation against the Islamic Republic itself. It's against the government structures, both as a way to limit Iranian ability to retaliate, but, and I think Netanyahu has said it himself, it's to try and force the Islamic Republic to fall. You've written, I name checked one of your books, but you also wrote about the history of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. So perhaps put into context, what damage is being done to the Islamic Republic of Iran as a governing structure.
Well, I think most importantly, the way to look at this, right, is that the Islamic Republic, as it's currently configured, and particularly as it's been led by the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and the IRGC and Ali Khamenei are really the two principal parts of the ruling regime. The way that they have led the Islamic Republic of Iran is been focused on this idea of recreating a Middle East that is both in line with Iran's revolutionary ideological values, but also one that hopes to usher Israel out of existence, right? This is something that they've striven for, both ideologically and rhetorically, but also they have put billions of dollars and decades of effort into trying to build up a regional axis that could challenge Israel, could endanger Israel, and that maybe one day could defeat Israel, right? Before this attack began, Israel had already pretty much succeeded in rolling back Iran's regional gains, right? PIJ and Hamas are effectively destroyed in Gaza. Hezbollah has been heavily degraded in Lebanon. Syria, of course, collapsed, but its collapse was certainly assisted by, if maybe unintentionally and indirectly, by Israel's bombardment of IRGC positions and Hezbollah positions in Syria. And Iran has been basically left, on its own, right? Its proxies have gone away, right? So the one thing that Iran had left in order to sort of show something for itself was its vaunted missile program. And this missile program already took, let's say, a knock last year when Iran launched two of the biggest ballistic missile strikes in history against Israel and failed to do any really significant damage, right? So before Israel attacked, Iran was already in some ways a spent force regionally, and its deterrence was already collapsing. Now with Israel with Iran on the losing end of this war with Israel, the entire experiment of the Islamic Republic, the entire effort, the credibility, the thesis, the idea of the Islamic Revolution as articulated by Ali Khamenei and IRGC is completely unraveling, right? And so even if they survive as an entity, they have lost any semblance of what it was to be them, right? They have lost the narrative. They have failed in the one quest that they sort of set out for themselves. So I think that is more significant than anything else, is that this is really a turning point for the Islamic Republic of Iran. It may continue to exist as a ruling regime, but it will be a ruling regime, I think, with different priorities and different abilities going forward.
The timing of the Israeli strikes I find to be very interesting, right? When Donald Trump assumed the presidency, he tasked I call him an envoy for everything, Steve Witkoff, who was dealing the negotiations with Putin over Ukraine, but he was also tasked with dealing with the Iranian nuclear file. And Trump had given a 60-day deadline to reach agreement on, I don't want to say a return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, but more or less a return to the Iran nuclear deal under different parameters, perhaps with a stamp of it was negotiated by Trump. On day 61 is when this began. So perhaps put into context how the Iranians were dealing with the Trump administration and how that fit into perhaps the Israeli calculus to go about 24 hours or even less after the 60-day timeline had expired.
Yeah. So this might not be apparent to everyone who follows American politics or who follows Iranian politics. But if you are an Iranian decision maker, your experience with Trump is not limited, right? You had 4 years of Trump before the second administration took power. And in those 4 years, even though the Trump administration was hawkish on Iran, pulled out of the nuclear deal, reimposed unilateral sanctions on Iran, certainly rhetorically was very tough on Iran, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, which of course was, a real break from previous U.S. administrations. It had done all this stuff, but whenever there was an opportunity to start a war against Iran or to retaliate against Iran directly, Trump himself walked away, right? So, for example, I think it was in 2018, you had Iran down a U.S. A U.S. Reaper drone over the Persian Gulf. Trump threatened to hit Iran. There was a lot of reporting about the battle plans that were all drawn up. Planes were in the air. At the last minute, Trump decided not to attack, right? And he was very apparent of why he didn't want to attack. He said, listen, I was told, 150 people would die, and I didn't think that that was okay. We had lost a drone. A drone didn't have anybody. Nobody died on our side, so I didn't want to kill anybody on their side. Fair enough. You had the 2019 Aramco strike, right, where Iran uses missiles and drones to hit Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia asked for U.S. assistance to go after Iran. Trump says, well, we might do something, but Saudi Arabia's got to take the lead and they got to pay for it. Saudi Arabia decides not to do anything. We decide not to do anything. Finally, you have the assassination of Qasem Soleimani himself, right? This is an emphatic sort of use of U.S. military power. But then that's followed by Iran's ballistic missile attack on the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq, targeting U.S. forces, the biggest ballistic missile assault on U.S. forces in history up until that point. And again, we were poised to respond. Planes were in the air. We were about to drop bombs, and Trump at the last minute called it off, right? So if you're Iran's decision makers, you have good reason to believe that that President Trump does not actually want a war. That President Trump doesn't actually want to use military power against Iran. Doesn't want to get involved in another Middle East war, right? And that was the first administration when Trump was surrounded by real hawks, right? You had Bolton, you had Pompeo. In this new administration, right, the Trump was elected in part to end wars. And there's this real strong side of his base that strongly believes that a war against Iran, another war in the Middle East, is not something that's in America's interest. So if you are Iran and you know that that's part of his base, and you know his track record, then I would suspect that the supreme leader of Iran and the decision makers around him did not actually think that the U.S. would either A, go to war with Iran, or B, allow Israel to do what it's doing now. That being said, things have changed. Right. Iran was much weaker this time around than they were 4 years ago. And I think that was enough to change the calculation in both Israel, but also in Washington, that if you were ever going to do it, this was the time to do it. And even though the U.S. isn't involved right now, it certainly is not just standing by. It's helping, knock down Iranian ballistic missiles being fired at Israel. Right, so it involves U.S. forces. So yeah, I think I would have thought that the Iranians would have appreciated the moment and thought a little more deeply about this. But what the Iranians like to do whenever they negotiate is to string out negotiations. They like to argue over periods, over adjectives, over qualifiers. They like to make agreements, that are nothing more than agreeing to meet again in a week, right? They like to string it out. And I think, this time it did not work for them.
Well, that's why I brought up the Israeli aspect of this, because by all accounts, it seemed like the Trump administration had presented a pathway back to, let's call it, a return to a Trump nuclear deal. And the Iranians were considering it and debating what their counteroffer would be, to which I think they were supposed to meet this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, Sunday.
And it was the Israelis who said, we're not waiting for the Trump administration. So is it not the Iranians or the Trump administration who are sort of the sort of dyad players in this game? It was the Israelis forcing this moving forward. And I think, as we've seen in a really excellent report in the New York Times, that the Iranians were caught off guard by this dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think Tehran thought that Israel would be able to pull this off. And you know, it's always unclear. I mean, Israel, of course, is a sovereign country and can do whatever it wants, and has the power to do these things without the United States saying yes or no, or you can or you can't. But it's much easier for Israel to do this if the United States is complicit in some way, right? If the United States doesn't stand in the way and says, okay, well, if you do this, we need to get our guys ready. We need to sort of make changes. And I think the difference in this time around is that, Israel communicated its intentions, and the United States took action, right? We started to pull diplomats and embassies, out of the region. We started to move things around. So I'm not saying that the United States made the decision for Israel, but I think the United States made the decision a lot easier for Israel, right? And so in that respect, it's certainly Israel pushing the envelope here, right? But I think Israel needed a U.S. partner in order to make this happen.
So let's talk about, we're going to come to the role of the Trump administration, but let's talk about the nuclear program. I think the easiest way to think about the ongoing airstrikes, to the best of our knowledge, and there's so much fog and friction we don't really know, is that anything above ground associated with the nuclear program is no longer there. I think the Israelis have also succeeded, this came out from the IAEA today, in collapsing the underground hall at Natanz. The big question is, without the intervention of the United States, is Fordo. Fordo was once secret, was outed during the JCPOA negotiations by the Obama administration, subsequently declared and put under inspection. And as part of the JCPOA, they weren't actually allowed to enrich any uranium there, but that has since, with the expiration of, with our withdrawal from with the JCPOA, it now enriches uranium. And the most important part is it's under a mountain. So without a strike on Fordo, Iran will still have the ability to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon. So with all that lead up, what's your assessment on sort of the air campaign as you're seeing it from your seat? What are the objectives, and is it setting back the nuclear file writ large?
Well, I think it's clearly setting it back. I mean, I think there's no doubt that as you said, it's destroyed or hampered everything above ground. It may have had some success below ground, not just through collapsing, but through cutting power to cascades, right? There are two question marks for me, right? One is, well, three actually. One is what's happening with Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. We think it's an Esfahan, but it might not be an Esfahan anymore.
We don't know.
It could be further underground, right? So Iran possesses quite a lot. Two, what has Iran been hiding? We have no idea, right? That the IAEA did find sort of, residual highly enriched uranium in some of the cascades that was up to 90%, right? And they said this can happen accidentally or it can happen purposely. So we don't know if Iran has a secret stockpile, right? And then, of course, you've got Fordo, which is buried under a mile of rock. Theoretically, it seems that the U.S. possesses the ability to, with bunker busters, to take it out. But even so, if it's not, it remains, right? So I think there's, whether Fordo is taken out or not, I think there are scenarios in which Iran could still emerge from this with the ability to test a nuclear weapon, right? I don't think Iran is likely to become a meaningful nuclear power anymore, but could come out of this by saying we've joined the nuclear club. We are now sort of, I don't know. We now possess a deterrent. At the very least, we can unleash a dirty bomb. We can do something, that could make other people's lives difficult. But I think for the most part, Iran's, if everything stops today, maybe Iran is able to rebuild. But I think for the most part, Iran's nuclear enrichment program is probably toast. And I think it's probably toast for a couple of reasons. One, two things are likely to happen from reading the news, right? And things can change tomorrow. They can change 5 minutes from now. But from what seems to be happening in Washington and elsewhere, is that the Trump administration seems to be playing, a real sort of tough, or taking a real tough diplomatic line with Iran, which is basically saying, if you don't return to talks and agree to zero enrichment, which means shuttering all of your facilities, then we will help Israel in taking out Fordo, right? And if the U.S. takes out Fordo, then I think it's sort of fait accompli, right? I don't think that that it doesn't end in a panacea. It doesn't end in regional peace. But I think the idea of a nuclear in Iran, that possesses multiple nuclear weapons will no longer be the case. It could still, though, I think, maybe manage a test, which would, maybe be a cathartic sort of victory, but not a meaningful one.
One of the questions from the audience is the role of the IAEA. The news out of Iran is actually kind of hard to follow. And I'll admit to everybody, I'm at an all-day conference. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Europe. And so I'm not paying attention to the news every single minute of every single day like I normally would in this case. But Iran seems to have said its relationship with the IAEA is going to fundamentally change, and that its parliament, the Majlis, is thinking about withdrawing from the NPT, sort of as part of the consequences for Israeli action. So perhaps maybe talk about how the Iranians are thinking about the role of the IAEA after this ends, into what they are debating in terms of maintaining adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, it's difficult to say, because Iran's parliament sort of serves this role, right? Iran's parliament often has people that, not unlike our Congress, will say things that are a bit outlandish, a bit more extreme, right? Not that do not comport with policy, to sort of play, I don't know, bad cop to sort of the good cop of the regime, if you will, to put out a more maximalist position, that makes Iran's policies seem a little more reasonable in comparison. So they've talked about this before. This is nothing new. They've been talking about it a lot more over the last several months, not just withdrawing from the NPT, but also rethinking its nuclear posture, which up until this point has been that the supreme leader of Iran does not allow, under his interpretation of Islamic law, and this is meaningful sort of in Iran's system, for Iran to possess a nuclear weapon, right? So two things would have to happen for Iran to sort of change its stance, at least officially. One, the supreme leader would have to change his mind. He would have to change his fatwa, and that can happen. Circumstances are changed, wisdom has changed, right? You can revise a fatwa. But the other thing is that they would have to withdraw from the NPT. Now, and then kick out, IAEA observers, right? Which are not there, I assume, at the moment, and probably are not going to have much to come back to ultimately at the end of the day. So I'm not sure how much it matters. I mean, if Iran's facilities really are destroyed by the end of all this, it really won't matter. What will matter in the end is what happens to its stockpile, right? Where is it? Who accounts for it? How do you get a hold of it, right? And you would think that if Iran has any sort of settled ceasefire agreement or whatever, that ultimately that's gonna be something that comes out, right? So I don't know if it really matters. I think we've reached a crossroads here. If Iran has any ability to become a nuclear power, I think it will probably do so. If Iran no longer possesses that ability, then I think it will just sue for peace at some point and try to cut its losses.
Yeah, I mean, the IAEA is present in certain places via video. I believe the Iranians have disconnected those cameras, as part of this. But one of the facilities under safeguards, we are for certain, is now a pile of rubble. And so it's unclear, as you said, what the role of the IAEA will be going forward if the nuclear program is destroyed. And so this brings up the Trump administration. The Israelis have been lobbying quite overtly for the US to get involved. Uh, and I'm not sure Trump has made up his mind. I have an instinct, but that's just a guess, in that he would rather not get involved, but would like to see the potential, as you said, US entrance into the war as the hammer to force Iran into basically to agree to the deal that he wanted 4 days ago. But use that as a tee up to talk about what you think the role of the US has been and what you think the role of the US should be.
Well, to my mind, it's what we're trying to achieve, right? So, from my perspective, the problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially over the last 2 decades, when it really started to expand its regional power, has never been about the nuclear program or nuclear weaponization. Nuclear weaponization, or the prospect of nuclear weaponization, was simply something that was going to make the problem of the Islamic Republic much worse, right? The real problem of the Islamic Republic was its proxies, not just developing the proxies, but arming the proxies with long-range weapons like rockets, missiles, and drones that could be used against Israel and against U.S. forces, but primarily against Israel. With the removal of Iran's proxies from the scene, to my mind, the danger of the Islamic Republic was walked back. It was reduced. It didn't disappear because Iran's intentionality is still there. Iran's ballistic missile program was still there. So it's not that it was zero, but it was reduced. And to my mind, that made the need to focus on Iran less, right? To me, Iran was much less of an immediate problem, especially after Israel struck Iran in October of 2024, destroying some of its most sophisticated anti-air defenses, its Russian-made systems that Iran can't easily sort of replace, right? So, to my mind, there was not a need to do this. On the other hand, I understand the Israeli position, which is, listen, the Islamic Republic is at its weakest point. If we allow it to get stronger, it's only going to make it more difficult. Because Iran is at its weakest point, because its deterrence matrix has collapsed, right? Its proxies were toast and its missiles were ineffective. That leaves only the nuclear program as a credible deterrent. And Iran uses its nuclear program as a deterrent in two ways. One, nuclear enrichment is a deterrent, right? Because when Iran escalates its enrichment cycle, it gets Western capitals very uncomfortable. The Western capitals then turn to sanctions and they turn to talks to get Iran to compromise. This is what led us to the first nuclear deal, right? And this is what was leading us to the second one. The other way that Iran can use it as a deterrent is obviously to create a nuclear weapon. And that's something that is unclear what Iran was doing. Israel has come out and said that Iran was taking steps that it had never taken before, maybe rushing for a breakout. It's unclear, obviously, if that's what was going on or not, but that's what their intelligence assessment suggested. So if that's true, then I think there was a real cause, a real trigger to do what's going on now. For the United States, I would suggest the United States doesn't need to get involved any more than it is, and can much better use what's happening now for to strike sort of not just a nuclear deal, but something, perhaps more expansive than a nuclear deal. I mean, Iran's missile program has also been eviscerated, right? And so this is a great opportunity, to target that program. It's a great opportunity to target its drone program. It's a great opportunity to go after Iran for its weapons proliferation, right? There's lots of things that the U.S. could do that are beyond the nuclear file that they could use the current context in order to gain sort of on the diplomatic front. If the U.S. enters this conflict by dropping bombs, right, to me that really changes the U.S.'s role in diplomacy with Iran, right? Because it's not just sort of somebody who's standing by; it's now an aggressor, and this complicates, I think, how the Islamic Republic can deal with the United States, but also complicates how the Iranian people will feel about the United States. And up until now, for the most part, Israel has been hitting IRGC or nuclear facilities. Now, some of those facilities are co-located in urban districts in Tehran, or some of the officials that it's been targeting are in apartment buildings in Tehran. So civilians have been struck, right? Iranians don't appreciate this conflict, don't like this conflict, but I think, there is a grudging sort of realization for a lot of Iranians that so long as it's a war against the IRGC, it is something that may benefit everyday people. But the more expanded that war becomes, the more civilians that die, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Iranians to not start to side with the regime and seeing the regime as the only protector that they have.
Well, you preempted my next question, which was about rally around the flag, but there's two questions actually. And I'm going to come to rally around the flag next. But the first one is the regional dynamics. So we talked about the role of the US. Honestly, I don't think there's much of a role for Europe here as well. I don't think there's much of a role for Europe. Tell me if you disagree. And even the entrance of other large powers like Russia, I do think is ancillary. Where I think this is problematic is for the Gulf Arab allies who were fit to be tied about the first nuclear agreement, but because of their own decision to have rapprochement with Iran, largely because the Saudis and the Emiratis lost the Yemen war, more or less against Iran, they had sought to acquiesce to the Islamic Republic, and now find themselves in the uncomfortable position where they're probably quietly happy that the Israelis are eviscerating Iran's nuclear and missile programs, but have to outwardly be sort of pro-Iran. I don't know how else to say it. So perhaps put into context the regional dynamics before we get into internal dynamics in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got it at it pretty well. I mean, we have to remember that the reason why Saudi Arabia and UAE normalized relations with Iran wasn't just them losing the Yemen war. It was because Iran and the Houthis were starting to attack them directly, right? They lost their conflict with Iran. I mean, they challenged Iran regionally, both in Yemen and elsewhere, and they lost. Iran started to use force against them directly and indirectly, and they couldn't tolerate it. They didn't want to deal with missiles and drones landing in their airports and desalination plants. So they did an about face, and not only normalized with Iran, but really had that sort of hold your enemies close kind of thing, right? They became friendly with Iran, and things like Gaza and other things that have happened in the region has brought them together even more, at least outwardly, right? I would assume that MBS and MBZ are watching Al Jazeera and eating popcorn and high-fiving each other as this is happening. I don't think that there's any disappointment in what's happening against the Islamic Republic. I mean, I think they see it as the bully that bullied us is now getting bullied, and that's great. But there's a point at which that's not great, right? Because they had made peace with Iran, and Iran had ceased to be a problem for them. And Iran gained from that. It gained that closeness. But the more they stay on the sidelines, the more they are, let's say, guilty by association, as Iran might see it. The more their relationship with Iran might change. And even a weakened Iran is Iran that is more comfortable with discomfort than the UAE or Saudi Arabia, right? So if Iran decides to take this moment to say, you know what, where were you, MBS? Where were you, MBZ, when we were getting, slaughtered by Israel? You said you're our friends. You're not our friends. Iran can make their life really difficult in a lot of ways. They've already threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz again. I don't think it'll happen, but it could. They can go back to sort of sabotage, against regional shipping. They can do the Houthis, of course, can do all sorts of things. And the Saudis and the Emiratis know this. And so I think they are trying to really thread the needle here by, on the one hand, maybe being privately pleased with Iran getting taken down a notch, but also uncomfortable where it may lead, right? Because if Iran leaves this broken, but also with nothing more to lose, that's really bad for the region. Iran had a lot to lose up until this war, right? It wanted to preserve its relationships with its neighbors. It wanted to preserve its own security. But if it has nothing else to lose, then I think it can make the Gulf a lot more uncomfortable. Maybe not tomorrow, but a year from now, or even 5 years from now. So I think there's a challenge there. Qatar has been, of course, and much more outspoken than the others about this. But I think there's also other things beyond the Gulf that are problematic here, right? And Iran plays a strange role in a lot of different conflicts. And one of the conflicts that it plays a strange role in is the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. Iran is the main sort of, even more than Russia in some ways, main sort of protector of Armenia. And so a weakened Iran could incentivize more aggressive behavior by Azerbaijan, right? So there's a lot of, I think, second, third, fourth order effects of what's happening now that may not be obvious to any of us at the moment, but could sort of start to make waves in the region in the coming months.
So we have a bunch of questions about sort of like dynamics inside of Iran, and they basically boil down to, is there a rally around the flag effect? And two, I think a lot of what's coming out is coming from opposition sort of Telegram chats, so who is the opposition in Iran? If to the best that you can explain it in the next 5 minutes, the various actors involved here, to include our former friends from Beverly Hills. And then three is, what other power centers are there within the regime, between the regular military, the IRGC, and all these different factions that sort of make up the governing coalition in Iran?
Right. So let's go to rally around the flag, right? So on the one hand, 30 to 40% of the country supports the regime. The IRGC's own internal estimates are that 40% supports the regime. It's probably less than that. It's probably closer to 30, but it doesn't matter, right? So the regime has some support that is obviously rallied around the flag before bombs even start going. But that leaves a good 50%, 60%, depending on what time of day it is, that doesn't support the regime, either sort of emphatically hates the regime, or just would rather the regime go away. Those are the normal everyday Iranians, right? They're poor, they're rich, they live all over the country. They're minorities, they're Persian speakers, it doesn't matter. That's sort of the heart of the country. Most of them are probably unbothered by the idea of the IRGC getting weaker, right? The idea of these generals that are responsible for all the repression of human rights and domestic dissent in the country being killed, right? I think on the one hand, there's that sort of, okay, my enemies are sort of being hurt. On the other hand, they are also Iranians, right? And if we learned anything about Cold War movies in the United States in the 80s, right, it's that any attack on the homeland, makes people patriotic, right? Um, and there is no scenario in which Iranians are not going to take what's happening to their country personally, right? So even if it hits the IRGC, even if it hurts Khamenei, you're going to have people that are on the one hand thankful that the bad guys got it, and on the other hand, really insulted that their country is being bombed mercilessly by an enemy, right? And so the one thing that is difficult, I think, to appreciate about this is that Israel has a very unique place in Iran. If you go anywhere else in the Middle East and talk to anybody on the street, regular people, the views on Israel are pretty clear, and they're pretty black and white. In Iran, they're much more nuanced. The way that I sort of joke about it in class, or use the metaphor in class when I'm talking to my students, is that it's kind of like a parent who always makes their kid eat a certain vegetable, right? And the kid hates this vegetable because the parent always makes them eat it. And so they become sort of, irrationally sort of, dislike this green leafy thing. In Iran, Israel is kind of that thing. But the Islamic Republic has taught everybody to hate Israel, right? And because they've been thrusting it down the throats of regular Iranians just don't accept the Islamic Republic's narrative. So you have much more sympathy for Israel and much more complicated views of, let's say, the Palestinian crisis in Iran than anywhere else, I would say, in the world, frankly. Maybe outside of Germany, right? Like it's much more, it's a much more nuanced issue in Iran than I think just about anywhere else. My worry would be, and my counsel to the Israelis is, you don't want to push them over the edge, right? You don't want to push the Iranians, beyond into sort of, let's say, a more standard camp, right? And so I think that is the worry, because if you're ever to have a replacement of the Islamic Republic, right? Let's say this thing actually does engineer a regime change. You'd want that regime change to happen through people who dislike the Islamic Republic, dislike the regime, and want to adopt policies that are the opposite of the regime, right? How did we get into this mess? Well, the regime adopted all these policies. How do we get out of this mess? We're going to reverse all of those policies, right? You don't want to have a regime change that actually brings in a more hardened anti-Israel set of leaders. And I think that's the problem right now with sort of wishing for regime change, is you don't know who you're going to get.
And so maybe thinking about, and I think we should caveat this. I don't want to speak for you. I think regime change is a remote possibility, very low probability event. Perhaps you disagree with me, but a lot of the news that's sort of like being filtered out is by aggregator accounts who are putting it out on Telegram, and they are from ostensible Iranian opposition groups. Who are they?
Well, frankly, you don't have any real organized Iranian opposition inside Iran. You have lots of people who don't like the regime, lots of people who are against the regime. If you had a group, it would be young people, right? But that's not a political group. That's not an ideology. It's just regular human beings that want regular human rights. You do have lots of diaspora groups that are opposition groups. You have the MEK, for example, the Mojahedin al-Khalq, which is kind of the boomer crowd, if you will, the people who broke with the revolution in its early days and are have been out of the country since the 80s. You have royalists around the son of the last king, who have a lot of support in places like Los Angeles and Bethesda, and maybe have some support inside the country, but I don't think it's that much. And then you have a smattering of other people. You have human rights activists. You have sort of you you have human rights activists of various stripes. You have intellectuals. You have other sort of diaspora sort of potentates, but none of them have been able to organize into anything unified or even that I think coherent in terms of its opposition to Iran. The one thing that Iran has done really well, and the IRGC has done really well, is stamping out a networked, organized opposition. They have done this, I think, to the detriment of their security in every other way, but they've been very good at internal oppression. So to answer this, sort of, or to tie a bow around it, I would say that there is no organized opposition in Iran as yet.
That leads to a natural question, and it came from a member of the audience as well, is that at some point there will be concern, if this continues to go this way, of the regime actually being destabilized. So it's the Goldilocks thing, where you don't want it at one level, you don't want it at the other, you want it just about right, just weak enough to where it's not a threat to your security. And that's very hard to affect as an external actor. So when do you think people, sort of external actors, will start to put pressure on the Israelis to stop what they're doing?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
do I.
it's not happening now. I would say that if Israel sort of expanded its mission set and started to just bomb things in more urban centers, if more civilians started to be killed, I think that's when you would start to see pressure, right? I already suspect that the Israelis are running out of useful targets because they are hitting, unless they just have a lot of extra ordnance, because they're already hitting lots of things that are not a danger in any way, right? Old F-14s.
That was as a fan of Top Gun, that was a personal insult to me.
How's Maverick going to get out of the country now, right? Like,
right.
So to me, like they're just sort of going after whatever at this point. They've hit all the most important stuff. In terms of regime change, I don't think regime change is a likely scenario in the sense that the way that people hope about it online, right? Which is, we should push for regime change. Now's the time, because you don't have an opposition that can take over. What you're more likely to have is a regime change of a different sort, right? Which is an internal coup, right? Where you have members of the regime or members of the military who see something flawed about what their leadership is doing and decide to sort of take action, right? And this could play out over months. This could be immediate. If Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, if he's killed, which some people are advocating for, you're gonna have regime change, right? But you don't know what you're gonna get, and you're most likely not gonna get what you want. So what would be interesting to me, right, is, to me, Israel is certainly weakening the regime in all sorts of ways, but weakening the regime as an external actor. They're not weakening the regime as an internal actor, right? And it's the internal power of the IRGC that matters in terms of regime stability. And so long as it retains that power, the regime is probably going to be fine. But if Israel, let's say, starts hitting Basij bases in cities across Iran, if they start hitting police barracks, right? One, you're going to be killing a lot of regular Iranians, which is problematic from a regime change perspective and in other ways. But you would also be weakening the regime's ability to exert control over the population. So until I see that, I suspect that Israel's aim is not regime change. Rather, it is just to weaken the regime as an external actor as much as possible.
We have about 9 minutes left, so let's talk about the U.S. response. This also came up as a question as well. The U.S. is, I believe, positioning 2 carriers in the region. Has been widely talked about on open source. Plane Watchers on Twitter, I think, has moved well over 24 tankers into Europe with the expectation that they could, help enable U.S. offensive operations. So as somebody, I don't want you to speak for DoD, you do not speak for DoD, but as somebody who sort of understands that world, can you talk a little bit about the U.S. preparations, perhaps to enforce, let's say, Trump's demand that Iran cuts a deal along his terms?
Right. So the one thing I would say is that you don't do this just to do it, right? This is a really, really, really expensive effort that interrupts a lot of regular business for the military, a lot of regular deployments, right? Anything you pull out of one theater is going to affect another theater, right? And not just another theater immediately, but it's going to affect it for months, if not years, because of the way these deployment schedules work. So these decisions, I suspect, are not taken lightly, and they're not just for show. That being said, in terms of show, they show a real commitment from the Trump administration that it is willing to use military force against Iran if Iran doesn't come to the table, right? So the Trump administration is doing just about everything short of dropping a bomb to message to the Iranians that they will drop that bomb if the Iranians are not willing to come to the table, probably immediately, right? So the challenge with that type of diplomacy is that it ceases to have an effect if you put really strict limits on it and you don't abide by those limits, right? So if we said, if you don't come to the table by midnight, on Friday, we're going to bomb Fordo. If Iran, calls up 11:59 and says, hey, let's talk on Sunday, they're either calling your bluff or weakening your position, right? But if we don't drop the bomb when we say we are, that type of diplomacy isn't going to really have an effect. So my guess is that the U.S., even though Trump has been very clear that the U.S. doesn't want to get involved, that the U.S. is willing to get involved if Iran doesn't come to the table.
I guess this is the final question here as we come to the top of the hour is there's a lot of moving pieces here. If you had to project forward, sort of benchmarks to think about what to watch for, like over the next, I want to benchmark it like 36 hours. What are you looking for as sort of indicators of where this is going?
Well, I feel like we already know where it's going, right? There's two likely outcomes. Iran comes to the table, makes a deal, its nuclear program is no longer a thing. Or Iran withstands whatever the world throws at it, and either does a nuclear test or just tries to rebuild on its own with the support of Russia and China over time, right? At some point, there's going to be, Israel, and if the United States gets involved, the United States too, are going to be throwing good money after bad by just bombing Iran relentlessly. At some point, they're going to stop. There is no utility in just, turning Iran into Gaza, for example, right? That's just going to lead to way too many problems for everybody in the world, not just in the region. So there's going to be a point in which they stop because they've met their objectives. Iran might be willing to suffer that in order to emerge from that with its head held high and not having compromised. Or Iran's going to compromise. To me, those are the two absolute sort of definite things are going to happen. Iran, takes it, or Iran compromises. After that, I think it's much more interesting of where we go from here, because I think the Islamic Republic is going to be fundamentally different going forward. What it does in the region, what it does internally is going to be different. Two, if there is no regime change, I think the regime is going to be much more brutal to its people, at least in the short term. They're going to blame the people for the security lapses that allowed Israel to have such an upper hand in the early part of the conflict, and they're going to take out their humiliation on the Iranian people. So I fear a lot for the Iranian people. they're also going to want to protect the regime, right? And that means, doing everything they can to coup-proof again. But after that's done, I think, well, I don't really know what it's going to look like with a weakened Iran. It really depends on how the region relates to it, how Israel and China, or sorry, how Russia and China relate to Iran, how much they want to rebuild Iran. Yeah, I think that's a really open-ended question that is difficult to answer.
With that, Afshon, we're going to call it. We've been talking for about 55 minutes here. Thanks for doing this. Thank you all for attending. We all appreciate it. Obviously, stay tuned for your emails if we have any follow-ups to this or other events into the future. And with that, everybody, have a good day, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.